We've been looking at planned obsolescence, and planned obsolescence is pretty easy to conceptualize in your mind if you're talking about a product. And that's mostly what you will find if you do a little bit of research into it. Um, the videos that you will find on YouTube will talk a lot about things like iPhones and music devices, as well as technologies such as CDs and DVDs and things like that, I suppose. Um, so, this video, the truth about planned obsolescence, and it talks about perceived obsolescence as well as planned obsolescence, which I think is really interesting because it introduces that idea of social context as well. And then there's planned obsolescence that comes into it with things like technology. So you guys might be aware that Apple was heavily scrutinized or criticized in the last year or so for deliberately creating software that slowed down older devices. So even though the physical device should still function really well, the software meant that the device no longer worked. People got frustrated and then they went out and purchased new products. What you might not quite understand is how we can connect this idea of planned obsolescence to more civil structures or civil contexts such as houses, buildings, roads, all sorts of things like that. So it should be kind of an obvious thought to you that engineers don't design buildings to fail. Okay, so when we talk about planned obsolescence in a civil context, a bridge, for example, we don't want the bridge to fail in 20 years or in 50 years. However, what we do want to know is that the materials and the techniques that are being used, mainly I suppose around the materials, but we want to know what sort of lifespan those materials might have. So in Unit 3, you'll learn more about life cycles, and we do life cycle analysis. You learn about things like concrete cancer, okay? But really, it's about recognizing that a building should be guaranteed, if it's built well for say 20 to 50 years. If you get longer than that, you're doing pretty well. And there's maintenance and things like that that need to go into these structures as well. I came across this article by Steve Watson from University of Queensland, and it is talking about environmental design, environmental engineering, I suppose, and architecture. It's really interesting because it allows us to look at things in a slightly different way that's still related and it poses some interesting thoughts. So it introduces this concept of a building life cycle, and the author talks about how there are different stages of a building's life cycle. Okay, and I quite like this quote that I pulled out. However, as Brand, he's another author, in 1997 states in regard to the architect's role, a building is not something you finish. A building is something you start. Once designed, a building may be seen to have its own life of its own. It's kind of an interesting thought. As you continue through the article, and you can go and read this whole article if you like, you don't have to, but as you go through the article, you'll find some interesting stuff like this. So there are 6 phases of this building life cycle. It starts at the initiation phase, goes into production, construction, operation, maintenance, and then finally the disposition. Okay, so and that is obviously the disposal. So it talks about different aspects of that, and it brings some interesting thoughts about a life cycle, and that you can tie this into this concept of planned obsolescence, if you like. So one of the things that I find interesting here is it talks about, if you've got, say, a factory, if that factory comes to the end of its life as a factory and a developer comes along and decides that they want to turn that factory into a residence, then it actually starts the process again, and it starts that chain or that life cycle again. And we could go through and maintain that building, we can change things up. But if you're then connecting it back to the concept of planned obsolescence, it then starts that process again of saying, okay, well, if we're using steel or if we're using timber frames, how long can we expect those building materials to last before they might need to be replaced? Now, ultimately, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes in, like social contexts to do with ongoing trends and fashions. Um, so, a house, for example, it might still be structurally sound, but after a while, people decide, well, I don't really like the form that it is, or the way that we've lived our lives is different. So um, it becomes obsolete through its age uh, because of social reasons and things like that. So there's lots of different aspects to it, but I just thought this was a really interesting article to make you think about this concept of obsolescence in a more of a civil context and get you to think of things a little bit differently.